In the second part of presentation, we will try to understand the developments after independence, what kind of forest policy emerged, okay, what was the situation of forest department after independence, what kind of policy we adopted towards forest management. All these things will be discussed, and apart from this situation, we will also try to understand uh, some kind of legal developments related to forest management, that is related to Wildlife Protection Act, Forest Conservation Act, and PESA. We will try to understand all these laws, and we will also focus on the changing nature of tribal communities' political consciousness in this period. So when we start with understanding the situation of tribal communities and forest governance in post-independence India, what we have to understand is that actually, as far as the governance of tribal areas were concerned, we adopted the framework uh, established by colonial rulers. And in this situation, we have to understand that we can find two parallel processes, okay, like colonial rulers, uh, like in colonial period, on the one hand, we found that colonial rulers exploited forest resources, but they also tried to show some kind of benevolent face towards tribal communities. So the same process was there after independence. The only crucial difference was that Indian Constitution made some important provisions for the rights of tribal communities, and we can find that there is a provision of Schedule 6 in the Indian Constitution which gives some crucial rights to northeastern states. For example, there is a provision of the constitution of autonomous district councils in northeastern states. And the provision of autonomous district council is important because we can find that over the period of time, it has been a crucial institution to give certain powers to local communities to manage their resources. So in this uh, form, we can say that it has been successful provisions as far as the rights of local communities in northeastern states are concerned. Now, there are some important provisions in Schedule 5 areas too, and we know, as we discussed, that actually now Schedule 5 areas or fifth schedule areas are those areas which were in colonial period partially excluded areas. Okay, so and in this category, there are many tribal areas are included. Right now, tribal areas of 10 states, different districts of these 10 states are part of Schedule 5 areas. But as I mentioned in the first part of my presentation, that we should not understand this point, that actually all tribal areas are which are not part of northeastern areas are part of Schedule 5. There are many tribal areas which are actually not part of Schedule 5, like tribal areas of Kerala, tribal areas of Karnataka, some tribal areas of Uttar Pradesh, and some small pockets of Bihar are not part of Schedule 5 areas. And there have been demands for inclusion of these areas in Schedule 5 too. But right now, for our purpose, what we have to understand is that what are the crucial features of Schedule 5. So I just want to give you some crucial points related to Schedule 5. According to Section 5.1 of the Schedule 5, governors of the states with scheduled areas have powers to refuse the implementation of any laws passed by the parliament or state legislative assemblies, or he or she can give direction for necessary changes before enforcing them in these areas. Obviously, both these constitutional categories, that is Schedule 5 and Schedule 6, are examples of sub-state or region-based constitutional asymmetry in the Indian federalism. Indian state, if we think about the experiences of Schedule 5, um, because I mentioned that one provision of Schedule 6 have been more or less successfully implemented, and that particular aspect, that is the creation of autonomous district councils, uh, has given lots of rights to local communities in Schedule 6 areas. So if we just focus on the experiences of Schedule 5, we can find that actually no governor ever used its power regarding these areas. And Dr. B.D. Sarma, who was a famous activist and the leader of Bharat Jan Andolan, and he played an important role in the enactment of Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act PESA. Uh, um, he termed uh, the Schedule 5 or the experiences of Schedule 5 as broken history of unbroken promises. It means that promises were made, but they were always broken. No government tried to keep its promise as far as tribal areas are concerned. The another important aspect about forest governance is that Indian constitution also accepts the validity of Forest Act of 1927, and in Indian state continuously exploited the forest on the name of national development. So what we have to remember is that in colonial period, the key idea was imperial interest. So Britishers exploited or overexploited forest resources to fulfill their imperial interests. And after independence, Indian state continued with this kind of overexploitation of forest resources on the name of national development. Now, if we look to forest policy of 1952, we'll find that it argues or it states that the state should use the forests for national development. It argued in the policy, it was argued in the policy that no village could claim the ownership of natural resources based on its location near that forest. So no tribal community can claim that actually they have more claim or ownership rights over natural resources just because they are situated at that place according to this policy. So the whole process of using or exploiting natural resources for the national development led to the disposition of tribal communities from their own forest land and its resources, and which actually created a situation of dispossession of tribal community. The problems of forest dwelling communities have increased after independence. Following developments led to deprivation and marginalization of these communities, including scheduled tribes. First, many new areas were made forests, but the rights of people who were living there from time immemorial was not settled. Second, it led to the extension of the forest department and its controlling power of the lives of local communities. Why? Because once an area was declared as forest and the rights were not settled, then obviously the communities who were living or the people who were living there became encroachers. So when they became encroacher, they were under the arbitrary behavior of forest department officials. So they became totally dependent for taking anything from forest or even doing their agricultural work on the forest areas just because they had no paper to prove that actually they have been living on that particular piece of land from many, many generations. So actually, the power of forest department increased. Third, forests were hugely exploited on the name of national development, as I mentioned earlier. The post-colonial Indian governments were continued the colonial policy of scientific forestry. And now what we have to remember about or understand about scientific forestry is that uh, instead of mixed forests, it promoted one kind of forest so that that particular forest could be used for industrial benefits or industrial works or for national development. Through this policy, industry-friendly trees were planted at the cost of mixed forests, which caused enormous disadvantages for both forests and wildlife. Fourth, after 1970, Indian state made several laws to improve the situation of wildlife because by mid 1960s, it was realized that due to the exploitation of forest resources, wildlife is facing a huge crisis. And as I mentioned, that actually the seeds of this crisis were, put in the colonial period only. So colonial rulers created this kind of situation, which intensified in post-colonial period. So due to this understanding, in 1972, the Parliament passed the Wildlife Protection Act, which has given state powers to create national parks and sanctuaries. It restricted the human activities in these areas, especially in national parks, and made a provision that people residing in national parks should be relocated. And it also gives power to the park administration or the forest department, which had power to control the activities of human being or tribal communities or for forest dwelling communities in these areas to to criminalize their activities, to actually slap different kind of cases if forest department would find that they are indulged in any kind of activities which are dangerous for wildlife. So what I'm trying to say here is that actually the Wildlife Protection Act gave enormous power to park administration or the forest department, which was or which is managing the affairs of that park area. So with 1927 Forest Act, the Wildlife Protection Act was another, we can say a huge law or very forceful law in the hands of forest department to control the life of local communities. In 1980, the Parliament passed the Forest Conservation Act, which, apart from other things, clearly underlined that no forest land would be diverted for non forest use. The irony is that these laws, both Wildlife Protection Act and Forest Conservation Act, have been used to restrict and control the activities of local communities because there are different kind of provisions in both these laws which actually uh, give lots of power to forest department or central authorities. But both these laws, there have been provisions which actually also questions, or also place some kind of conditions for forest department, and those provisions were never implemented properly. For example, the according to Wildlife Protection Act, the villages should be relocated. They must be given the same space, same amount of land, um, while relocation from one place to another place. But very few villages of the from the national parks were relocated. It should also be noted that for the sake of development and to fulfill the interest of corporate capital, forest lands were usually diverted for non-forest use. The thing is that forest department and state authorities used both these laws to curtail the rights of local communities and to create their or to establish their dominance over the affairs of forest areas. And they were not successful, both these laws have not been successful to create a situation of uh, in the case of Wildlife Protection Act, to protect the interests of wildlife, or to prohibit the tendency to convert forest land for non-forest purposes as we can say revenue land. This has been a tendency, and even after Forest Conservation Act, different states converted forest land into revenue land just to give some kind of profit to private players, or to create a situation of development for the local communities. So what I'm trying to say here is that apart from giving lots of powers to forest department, the both the laws uh, have been more or less failed in achieving their actual goals. Now, we should also remember that the situation changed in 1970s as far as the political consciousness of tribal communities uh, is concerned. Now, the we know, as I mentioned in the earlier part of my discussion, that tribal communities revolted against the rule of Britishers. Okay, and they revolted more than 100 times. So there was a tendency to revolt against any kind of suppression in tribal communities. But we can find that they started to learn the importance of law. They started to learn the importance of democratic mechanism by 1970s, because different kind of small organizations started to work in these areas. So and after emergency we can find that many grassroots organizations started to work in these areas, and these due to their active role in these areas, they not only contested the imposed development model by the state, but they also created a political awareness in the minds of local communities. And we can find that different movements emerged against the imposed development model. We know some movements, but there are many other movements which are not well known, but they worked at the grassroots level. So I just give you two examples. One is Chipko Andolan, which was started in 1973, and the second one is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which started in 1980s, and they are prominent examples of this type of struggle. And a famous political theorist Rajni Kothari has used the term non-party political process, because all these movements and their activities emerged outside the boundary of political parties, and they raised the question of the interests of local communities. So what we have to remember is that these movements can be termed, as Rajni Kothari termed them, non-party political process. And it is also important to note that Maoists also played an important role. They started their work in forest areas in late 1970s or in early 1980s, and their activities spread in many forest areas after that. And they played an essential, an important role in making forest communities more conscious of their forest land rights and resources. Obviously, they have been using violence in their politics, and we cannot, at least I cannot subscribe their politics, but we cannot rule out the important point that their politics also created some kind of awareness about the rights over forest land and its resources in the mind of local communities, tribal communities. And all these factors actually led to a situation where grassroots movements started to demand more and more rights over forest land and its resources. They started to oppose all kind of displacement on the name of development. And all these things resulted in a new forest policy in 1988, which mentioned the need to involve local communities in the activities of the forest department. So forest department since colonial period have been behaving as if it is the sole owner of the land, all land which is coming under the category of forests. Okay, so we can find that 1988 forest policy is actually changing this kind of approach of forest department. And after that, the government started a program, Joint Forest Management, in 1980, and which was based on the basic philosophy of the 1988 forest policy. Now, the basic idea behind JFM was to increase the cooperation between forest department and local communities about the issues related to forest management. So the idea was that forest department will take the help and suggestions from the local communities, and both of them will try to make forest a more better place for their own livelihood, or the for the existence of wildlife. But what happened, actually, that the forest department used this whole idea of JFM to give some kind of daily wage work to villagers or the local communities, and it presented itself as the malik or owner of the forest. So actually, the joint forest management could not achieve its basic aim to create a kind of common working space for both forest department and local communities. So what is important here is that we can find that in 1970s the Indian state increased its control through Wildlife Protection Act and Forest Conservation Act. So there is a whole system of centralization, okay, through these laws and through the inclusion of forest from in concurrent list. So earlier it was part of a state list, but it was transferred in concurrent list. So all these were actually an example of increasing centralization. But as I mentioned, that due to certain emergence of grassroots organizations, we can find that a new kind of situation emerged in tribal areas, and which actually led to the release of a new forest policy in 1988, and then joint forest management. But a new kind of demand emerged, and that demand was actually related to giving more rights on forest resources. And the demand of PESA actually expressed all these demands. So if we focus on PESA, we will find that PESA was largely related to the extension of Panchayati Raj system in scheduled areas. So in 1993, the Parliament passed the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments to give Panchayati Raj and municipalities constitutional status. However, it was mentioned in this amendment that the Parliament would pass a separate law for fifth scheduled areas, which would be sensitive to the local conditions of these areas. Many grassroots tribal organizations, particularly the Bharat Jan Andolan, an organization formed by B.D. Sharma on 2nd November 1991, worked hard to mobilize tribals in favor of separate Panchayati Raj law for fifth scheduled areas. Now, the PESA is an important law which was enacted in 1996 after mobilization by Bharajan Andolan and many other grassroots organizations. It is an important law because it is first of all, it is for not for the whole country, it is for the scheduled areas, scheduled 5 areas, uh, and it gives a framework for an autonomous life for tribal communities or scheduled tribes who are living in schedule 5 areas. So there are many limitations of these laws, but for our purpose, I mean, if we want to understand the impact of PESA on forest management or rights of local communities, particularly scheduled tribes over forest resources, we must focus on PESA because PESA is giving them rights over forest resources, primarily the minor forest produce, uh, which tribal communities generally collect from forest to fulfill their day-to-day needs. And it also gives many important powers to Gram Sabha. So, for example, consultation with Gram Sabha is necessary before any kind of acquisition of land. And then it also gives Gram Sabha important rights about managing the affairs of the village. So since it is giving some crucial rights over forest resources, it is important law as far as the forest governance in India is concerned. But as I mentioned, that this law was limited for schedule or is limited for schedule 5 areas. And it is also an important point that PESA has not been implemented properly in most of the states, because it gives so many powers to Gram Sabha. And I'm not going in the detail of these rights. I just want to underline that the enactment of PESA was an important event because it underlined that tribal communities have, or tribal organizations have power to mobilize themselves and pressure or put pressure on different political parties to enact a progressive law for which gives them lots of important rights. Though this progressive law has certain limitations. For example, it is just for Schedule 5 areas, and even within Schedule 5 areas, it is talking about the rights of scheduled tribes. Okay, so we know that there are many communities in scheduled areas too, which are equally backward, which are actually facing different kind of problems like scheduled tribes, but they are not part of the category of scheduled tribes. They are Dalits, they are lower backward castes, so the PESA is not including them. But what we have to remember is that from decentralization to decentralization, we can find a process from decentralization to decentralization in the issue of forest governance in in these decades. So it started with the idea of using forest resources for national development. Then many laws were made to centralize this whole process of wildlife protection, and which gives lots of power to forest department. Then Forest Conservation Act, but then we can find that a change occurred and a discourse emerged, according to which more power should be given to local communities, and which resulted in 1988 forest policy, new forest policy, and then joint forest management in 1990, and then the enactment of 1996 PESA. But we can find that due to certain limitations of PESA and many other issues related to forest management, the tribal communities and other forest dwelling communities who were dependent or who are dependent on forest resources, they were actually facing existential problems in these areas, which resulted in the demand of the enactment of Forest Rights Act. So we will discuss about the enactment of Forest Rights Act in the next section of this presentation.